Well, this is going to be a different style necklace. Using this one, I've determined an inside diameter. These are going to be made up of beads, which are tapered in both directions, meaning they're thicker in both directions in the front than in the back. In other words, a double taper. Well, I've got some really nice material, some Micasa ebony and tulip wood, Brazilian tulip wood, and I'll go to work creating some rings from this material. First, an ebony ring. I'm cutting these segments, again, just under 9/10 of an inch, doing a dry fit, a test, and I've arranged them so I've got all dark wood on one side and some of the brown streaky stuff on the other side. Same kind of procedure for gluing these together using the half ring technique. Now while that's curing, I'll work on a tulip wood ring. I don't need as much tulip wood, so I've split this material so I can now gang cut segments the same length as the ebony segments, but a thinner or shorter in height ring. When gluing short rings, thin rings together, to get that hose clamp centered, it requires another piece of MDF underneath smaller than the ring, and the rest of the glue job is just like any other. So my ebony ring's dry. It's been cured for over an hour. I've done a little disc sanding. Now I can put these two halves together. So there's my first ring done. My last and third ring is made up of both ebony and tulip wood. I've cut the tulip wood segments about 3/16 of an inch shorter than my ebony segments. I need some spacer material made up of ebony to make up the difference. So I've milled this material, and now I'm cross-cutting little short lengths of this ebony. This is 24 pieces of ebony and 24 pieces of tulip wood, so to make it easier, I've paired them up first. Before I join these into a ring, I want flat surfaces again, and then I'll go back and do another dry fit, making sure nothing's moved on me. It's still a nice, fitting ring. Once this is confirmed, then it's another glue job, just as any other segmented ring glue job. To complete the construction of these three rings, here's the solid tulip wood ring. The two halves have been glued. And here's the ring with the ebony spacers being prepared for it to be joined back together to make a full ring. With the three rings completed, now it'll get interesting. I've got to build a jig because I'm going to turn these a special way. I've started here with a couple of squares of 3/4 inch thick MDF, about 8 inches square, maybe a little less than that. Located corner positions, and I'm just using a Forstner bit there to create a slot big enough in diameter or width to accommodate a washer, which will go on a number 14 screw. I'm now taping them together so that I can drill through in those slots a pilot hole for my screw threads. Now before taking this apart, I need to make sure I've got some reference marks, so I always put it back together the same way. Now I'm enlarging those pilot holes for the screw shank diameter, and I'm doing some kind of ugly lateral work here with the drill bit to create a slot for that screw shank. Not a professional way to do it, but it works, and it's quick and easy. Putting it back together with the screws, sucking up everything nice and tight, and then trimming the two edges here to make sure these edges are perfectly aligned. A quick job to mount a faceplate, and we're ready to go to the lathe. My first job is to check to see how flat this is turning, and it's turning very nicely. Had it not been, I would have had to have flattened it. A few scored lines which will help me with aligning things as I mount rings onto this plate. I've located the center, drawing a couple of cross lines which will help with alignment. And now I'm attaching my ebony ring using those concentric circles. That corner is dangerous. Keep your fingers away from that at all times. It will hurt you. So a little rough turning just to get it round and get the face flat. A little bit there on the inside. I'm going to part off the outside portion of this, about 5/16 of an inch thick, maybe 3/8 of an inch thick. I put that green line there just so I can put it back together the same way it was originally constructed. A little bit of flattening here, not ready for gluing, but just a smooth flat surface which will allow me to attach a ring temporarily so I can do a little work on this middle ring. Some hot melt attaches it. I'll just get it round, get it flat, and I will sand this to make it gluable. The outside edge, the outside perimeter has been matched up close to the ebony, which will make it easy to glue this together centered. My necklace is going to be thicker in the front, thinner in the back, a difference of approximately 1/4 inch. There's 3 layers, so each of the 3 layers needs to be tapered. That's the whole purpose of this jig with the screws. Loosening the screws and inserting little shims about 1/16 of an inch, and then tightening all the screws nice and snug puts a wobble on this ring, obviously, as it turns, which will create a tapered ring once I get this back to running true again. So a little turning there, getting it flat, going through the same kind of procedure with pencil lines and a sanding block, getting this ready to be glued onto the ebony ring. And the next chore is to get rid of the hot melt so I can remove this. It's a little risky, I don't want to drop it, so I'm going to use a plate of MDF with some double-sided tape just as a temporary holding device. I'll put that on with the tailstock, remove the rest of the hot melt so that I can remove my tulip wood ring, turn it around, and get it ready to glue onto the ebony. But the ebony, of course, has a wobble also because I've moved those plates. That has to be flattened. My technique for putting the tulip wood ring on is to center it on another plate of MDF, a couple dabs of hot melt just to hold it on, locate it with the blue tape rotationally, lots of glue, using the tailstock, centers it, lining up the tape and applying some clamps finishes the glue job. Then about an hour or so later, off come the clamps, and off comes the MDF. Turn the tulip wood down so it's flat again. I've decided I want a little more taper, so out come the screws, and in goes a thicker, fatter shim. This will allow me to turn that tulip wood a little more to get a little more taper. I want a fairly thin layer on one side and about 1/4 inch or so on the other side. So a little more scraping here, hit it with the sanding block and get this ready for the next layer. That next piece or ring is the piece of ebony that was parted off, and to put it back in place in the same orientation, I need to flip it around to flatten the surface where the parting tool was. So by using some double-sided tape, I'll just put it on here temporarily and then flatten it, turn it back around, and glue it back in the same position as it was parted. Now, in addition to flattening it, I also want a little taper on that ebony ring. So I enlarged the shim size, did my flattening, did my sanding block work. Now I've got a surface that's ready to be glued to the tulip wood in the right orientation and so forth. But I'm not going to glue it. I'm going to temporarily attach it with hot melt glue. I'm not gluing it yet because I need to offset it. In addition to being tapered in thickness from front to back, it's also got an inside diameter which is offset from the outside. So to create that offset inside diameter, I need to shift the whole assembly sideways. That's where the jig comes in. By loosening those screws and tapping on the edge, I'm going to move it about 1/8 of an inch as a trial. This is a little bit of guesswork. Tightening the screws and going back to the lathe. Here I'm removing the inner portion of that ebony. I'll be using that later, but I'm going to be putting a ring of solid tulip wood inside this outer rim of ebony. So I'll be gluing this on next, lining up my alignment, putting plenty of clamps around this thin, fragile ring to get that secured. So it's been over an hour. My outer rim of ebony's securely glued in place, a little truing up. And now I need to create a groove on the inside middle of this necklace. I'm going to install a piece of rubber tubing. This was purchased at a local automotive supply house. It's got an OD of about 1/4 inch. That's going to be embedded in the middle of the necklace. That piece of tubing will be trapped under this piece of tulip wood. So I'm mounting that, turning it round, flattening it, and then I'll have to sneak up on a very precise fit. A fit that goes inside the ebony rim and fits flush against the inner layer of tulip wood. This is a very tricky fit. It really takes some time to get that just right. But with this done, I can now proceed to glue this together. I've protected the ends of the tubing with tape to keep glue from going in there. I've referenced my rotational position with the blue tape, plenty of glue, and plenty of clamps around this. We'll let this sit for a while. Well, it's been a while, so the first step is to get this back down to being flush with the ebony. And I'm going to true up this outside for the final time. This will be the final surface on the necklace. And since it's convenient, I'll sand this area. Now I've decided to put a little more taper on this, so a little bit bigger shim goes in. That's pretty easy. Tighten up these screws nice and snug. And I've also decided to put a little more offset, so I'm tapping it off to the side just a little bit more. I'll flatten this one more time, and then I'm going to use a pencil coming up here in a second. This will tell me where the inside line is going to be. It's a preview, if you will, of what I'm going to cut. And after looking at this, I've decided, I've got a pretty thick area on one side, pretty thin area on the other side. I'm going to shift this just a little bit to put the thin area in the back of the necklace a little bit thicker. So after all that last shifting, I've got some work to do here getting this back to being true again. And I'm going to start working on a slot or a groove to put this piece of ebony on the inside corner. This is the piece that was parted off earlier. It's still got the reference mark. I want to put it back in the same orientation. Now, to do that, I'll flip it upside down on a piece of MDF that's been mounted so that I can put a taper and sneak up on a fit inside that tulip wood. So a few beads of hot melt glue and some work at the lathe, and this is now ready to be inserted into my recessed opening here. This was a tricky fit because it has to fit around the perimeter as well as the underside because that seam is also visible. It took a little time to get that just right. The glue job is nothing special, lots of glue, pushing this into place. Instead of clamps, I'll put some weight on here. Then it's a matter of waiting again. Time to do something else while this cures. Well, we're almost done with the turning part of the project. Back to the lathe. We'll get this surface all cleaned up and smooth. Work on this corner. I'll do sanding on whatever surfaces are running true. Then it's a matter of removing this from the jig. Some utility knife work here. Then I'll take my jig, open it up, clean it out with some compressed air, squeeze it back together so it's running flat again, and turn a recessed groove to act as a jamb. I'm orienting that same thickest spot in the same place on the jig. A few dabs of hot melt around here help secure it in the jamb. Then it's a matter of turning the ebony down to be similar to the ebony on the other side. That requires a little experimentation with the shim thickness, but getting this down to a similar thickness is the goal here. The inside's not turning true. Now we've got to shift the jig in order to do the same thing on this inside corner. Looks like we got to move it about a strong 1/8 of an inch or so, lock this down, and experiment to get that running just as true as we can on the inside. Clean up that corner, a little bit more sanding, and we finally got this ring hole turned cleaned up on all surfaces. A little power sanding on those 4 areas where the hot melt was and a little buffing. This is ready for the bandsaw. I'm going to divide this into multiple length beads. The front center bead will be 4 segments of tulip wood long, and then to either side the beads will be 3 segments of tulip wood, and then the remainder will be 2 segments each. Here are my 9 beads. Now there's rough edges that need to be cleaned up. For finishing, I'm going to wax the ebony and tulip wood. It gives a nice soft look, and the wax seems to be very compatible with ebony. Using a soft cloth, I'll get rid of any fingerprints and let these sit for a few days. In between, I'm putting the small beads, the same kind of beads that I did in the previous necklace. The assembly requires a long screw eye, so I've made one of those. That'll go in one end of the small bead on one side of the clasp. A piece of leather cord goes in the other end of that end bead. Some CA secures everything. I'm using a little lobster claw clasp. To put that on the other end, I've had to taper my cord and really wrestled it through, doubling up as it goes through that last bead. That was a little bit of a chore, but a drop of CA there and everything's together.